It's Monster Hunter! Yes! I've wanted to do a video series on Monster Hunter for a while. Still don't got 3DS capture, but outside of Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, I can improvise for footage. I've wanted to talk about the combat design in particular, since, well, the entire series is basically combat design the game. Though, truth be told, I thought I would be doing this after the Souls series in Zelda. But, what can I say? Monster Hunter World is hype! I say hype, but the game's not actually out yet at time of writing. At any rate, the Critical Hit episode this time will be a two-parter. One focusing primarily on the hunter and player gameplay, with the second one being a focus on monster and boss design. And this is going to be a huge undertaking, so this time around I've brought on a special guest and my good friend from Question Block Gaming. So how about you introduce yourself?
Oh hello, I didn't see you there. I run the channel Question Block Gaming on YouTube. I'm a variety streamer and a content creator that's been a gigantic fan of Monster Hunter since the PlayStation 2 days, with thousands of hours played across the entire series. You could say that Monster Hunter is one of my favorite game series ever, along with stuff like Zelda, Mario, and Mega Man. I've recently been diving a little bit deeper into the Monster Hunter series as a whole on my channel, in streams and videos, and it's been a fantastic ride while I've been waiting for the latest game in the series, Monster Hunter World, to finally come out.
Now, a big part of why I brought QB on, apart from him being a passionate fan of the series as well, is because my personal history with Monster Hunter is a bit spotty. My introduction to the series was with Monster Hunter Freedom Unite, which didn't click. The camera controls were garbage, the game didn't do much to explain itself and its complexities, it was on a PSP, and I don't like the PSP. But I've played the game again in recent years with better controls, and it still doesn't click, since I've grown accustomed to the more modern adaptations of the series. Tri and later 3 Ultimate were my first strong attempts to get into the series again, and while the combat design clicked better with me overall thanks to the better controls, it still fell flat with me due to the jank and sluggish underwater design, as well as the abysmal drop rate of the two games when it came to RNG, making this entry arguably more grindy than the other entries. I've since gotten to G rank with 3 Ultimate, but it still just rubs me up the wrong way. No, the game that hooked me, that really grabbed me by the bell end and dragged me into the rabbit hole that is Monster Hunter, was Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. Arguably my favorite 3DS title of all time. What with me having logged in roughly 400 hours into it. I won't be going much into my personal history with the series beyond this, but let this set the bar for where we are specializing in series knowledge. It should be fairly obvious who's going to be covering what within the series. Well, let's dig in. First off, we'll be discussing the role of the hunter, establishing and discussing the core mechanics of the game that remain more or less unchanged over the course of the series, and for those of you not familiar with the series or just getting into it, this should give you a general understanding of how the different aspects of the game design influence combat. Stamina is probably among the most important and prominent mechanics in the series. It's not at all that uncommon nowadays in action games, what with Dark Souls having popularized the mechanic in modern action RPGs. While there are a lot of similarities between the implementation of stamina in Souls and Monster Hunter, Souls' stamina system is characterized by the central role it plays in their combat. It's the pool from which your offensive, defensive, and evasive maneuvers draw. One might even argue that the focus of Soul's stamina design is more focused on survivability than combat, encouraging a more cautious playstyle, and this is where Monster Hunter distinguishes itself from the stamina system of the Soul series. If Soul's stamina is about survival, then Monster Hunter's is about risk-reward. More often than not, your stamina won't be depleting, regardless of the weapon you're using. Stamina's focus in Monster Hunter is primarily evasion and maneuverability. A notable portion of your time while hunting is spent repositioning yourself to get a good angle of attack, pursuing fleeing monsters, or evading while looking for a good opening to get your attacks in. For most melee fighters, the goal is to remain as close to the monster as possible to maximize damage efficiency, only backing off when you're in immediate danger, be it because the monster is preparing some large attack or your health is low. While this may sound very trying, it actually isn't as invasive as it sounds, as combat isn't as dodge-heavy as the Souls games play. Stamina usage is a calculated risk rather than a constant factor to game flow. There are, of course, exceptions to this. This is where the risk-reward aspect comes in. For example, some of your more powerful attacks may draw from your stamina. While these attacks are uncommon among many weapons, when they are present, It presents you with the choice of risking more damage to dish out more yourself, or conserve the extra stamina for emergency evasion. It's a small touch, but it's hard not to appreciate this attention to game flow. This, along with the game's other systems, allows Monster Hunter to avoid the same gameplay pitfalls that the Souls series suffers from, of pushing players into a particular playstyle. This is one of the key features of Monster Hunter that allows for a wide variety of playstyles, elevating it above its contemporaries. Now, while we won't be talking about monsters in this part, it'd be remiss of me not to talk about how the game empowers player through questing, crafting, and learning through play. One problem I have with a lot of action RPGs these days is the over-reliance on numbers in determining the outcome of combat. While Monster Hunter certainly has a minor number game element to it, they're a moot point if you lack the skill to back them up. The essence of Monster Hunter is understanding the monsters you fight, becoming in sync with them. Allow me to quote Roberto from Monster Hunter Stories briefly. Quote, "First time I faced a monster, it did not go well. I'm talking some epic failure here. I was just swinging my sword around like, ah! Then boom! I was flat on my back. But then I heard the whisper of the wind and the sound of a river flowing, and it blew my mind. The wind was like my breath, and the water like my blood. Get me? For a tiny moment, I was the monster, and the monster was me. I guess you could say I felt in sync with it." End quote. That's a bit cheesy, but the level of understanding you experience when the game finally clicks is euphoric, and indeed what probably made a lot of people fall in love with the series to begin with. Questing is pretty self-explanatory, but it ties these experiences to one another. When combined with the game's crafting systems for weapon and armor, you're provided with many opportunities to better understand the monsters you know, so you can go out and fight yet more monsters. It creates a great sense of progression and growth, and it never ceases to provide a sense of pride and accomplishment. While there are slight variations on questing and crafting mechanics, they're never so wildly different from their earlier iterations that they really are worth mentioning. Except, perhaps, Monster Hunter World, which has removed the division between single-player and multiplayer questing. Supposedly. Tying into the crafting, armor skills are an essential component of hunting. Apart from some ambiguity with what armor skills you'll get from armors in Monster Hunter 1 for PS2, every other entry is largely consistent with how armor skills are handled. Typically, any given piece of armor will have a certain number of points towards an active skill, or towards the effectiveness of the skill in the case of Monster Hunter World. Armor skills can have a huge impact on how a hunt goes. In addition to resistances and defense, they often bring players abilities like poison immunity, resistance to stun, your ability to dodge more efficiently, higher knockout potential against monsters, and a plethora of other abilities that, if I were to list them all here, would be a whole nother video. For the last of these essentials, we've got two relatively minor systems, meals and weapon maintenance. Meals are something every player quickly learns to eat before any quest. They basically boil down to buffs to attack, HP, defense, stamina, and resistances, with the occasional special ability thrown in there for good measure. Additionally, weapon maintenance, or as it's better known, weapon sharpness, is a core mechanic that affects your damage and your effectiveness in combat. As you battle, your weapon will slowly grow dull. The more sharpness is lost through combat, the less damage you'll dish out, and perhaps most importantly, it increases the likelihood of your weapon bouncing off of a monster. Unlike other games, where you'd have to take your weapon to a shop to get it repaired, it's a necessity to utilize whetstones to maintain your weapon sharpness whenever they get too low. Some might say this mechanic punishes players for fighting, but I'd argue it rewards you with higher damage output for maintaining your weapon sharpness. How much sharpness your weapon has depends on the weapon you're using, so how often it'll be necessary to sharpen your gear is largely up to player preference, as most weapons have some trade-off between higher sharpness and higher raw damage. With that out of the way, this seems like a good time as any to start tackling the evolution of the weapon and combat design. QB, take it away!
When Monster Hunter originally dropped on the PlayStation 2 in Japan, it only had a handful of weapons, a very small amount of maps, and honestly next to no content, especially compared to the amount of content in the newer games. The PlayStation 2 game introduced the Sword and Shield, Greatsword, Hammer, Lance, and both the light and heavy bowguns. Combat in the game was very, very basic, with most of the weapons not having their iconic moves. Greatsword couldn't charge, hammer couldn't charge, sword and shield couldn't use items while blocking, and the lance, well, the lance has remained mostly the same since its inception, but the basic idea for the weapon started here. The sword and shield is a quick weapon, meant for fast strikes to take advantage of the smallest of openings, and hide behind your shield when the monster strikes back. It's the fastest weapon in the early games, and is the most effective weapon at dealing elemental and status damage. The Greatsword is the iconic power weapon of the game, focusing on heavy cutting damage at the cost of mobility. It has a guard as well, allowing you to swiftly block monster attacks that leave you at a disadvantage. The satisfaction of cutting the tail off of a monster with a well-timed strike with this weapon is one of the greatest joys the series has to offer. The hammer also made its debut in this game, though it wouldn't become the beast of a weapon that it could be until later games in the series, as knockout damage wasn't included in the first gen. But more on that later. The lance was a heavily defensible weapon, probably the closest thing that Monster Hunter has to a traditional tank class. You hide behind a shield, get in the monster's face, and then poke it with a 3-hit combo whenever you see an advantage. The moveset for the lance wasn't very involved, and in fact might be the simplest weapon in the series to date, but that doesn't mean that it lacks strategy. Just that the emphasis is on pressuring the monster and then putting yourself in a favorable position. The light and heavy bowgun models are the ranged weapons of the game. Gunners typically hang back and wait for an advantage before setting up the weapon and then firing a few shots whenever you get that advantage. It's basically the exact opposite of the lance. One thing that I haven't really touched on is that all of the bladed weapons can have an elemental attribute to them, like fire, water, or thunder. If they don't have an element, they deal what is called raw damage, but they can also have a status that they can inflict, like poison or paralysis. What makes bowguns special is that the guns themselves aren't aspected with an element or a status. Instead, they use consumable ammunition to inflict the same statuses or ailments. This means that, especially in the early games, gunners would sacrifice inventory space in order to be more versatile in combat. So, what's the difference between the light bowgun and the heavy bowgun then? Well, the light bowgun, or LBG, has smaller ammo capacities and smaller overall shell damage, but it deploys and sheathes much faster than the heavy bowgun, leading to a much faster hit-and-run playstyle. The heavy bowgun, or HBG, has larger ammo capacities, its aim is much steadier, and it does more damage per shot, but it deploys a lot slower. The HBG can also be outfitted with a heavy barrel, which can increase damage even further, or you can outfit it with a shield to protect you from small hits while you're not shooting, similar to the sword and shield. One of the strangest parts about the original PlayStation 2 game was that the control scheme was based around the right stick. You would think that a PlayStation 2 game of the era would use the right stick to turn the camera and the face buttons to attack, but no. The right stick would make you attack, with the different directions performing different actions, which would later be mapped to button presses in the later games. The right stick attacking sort of made sense, with each direction being roughly mapped to a direction that you would be attacking, but comparing that control scheme to a more modern scheme is a nightmare, especially considering this meant that the D-pad was the only control mapped to rotating the camera. This was, indeed, the birth of the claw. Players around the world seemingly developed their own method of rotating the camera with their index finger while controlling their characters with their thumbs and simultaneously keeping a finger on the triggers. Now, if you've played Monster Hunter 1 on PlayStation 2, I'm sure you've noticed by now that I didn't mention the dual blades, and there's a reason for that. The PlayStation 2 version of Monster Hunter 1 in Japan didn't include them. In fact, the dual blades were only introduced in the G-Rank version of the game, the version that added a bunch of monsters, a couple of maps, and an even harder difficulty. In the United States release, despite the fact we didn't ever get the G-Rank version of the game, we did get dual blades as a sort of international consolation bonus. The original PlayStation 2 version of the game also had a heavy emphasis on online play from day one. A keyboard could be plugged into the PlayStation 2's front USB port, enabling easier access to chat as well. Connecting to the online servers for Monster Hunter 1 allowed you to move from Kokoto Village to Mineguard Town, a town that's since become iconic in the lore of the game. Mineguard Town was similar to an MMO's main city. It was a bustling hub where players connected and met up to go on quests, even if they weren't together in the same group. The online hub was where most players met up and exchanged information in an era before the wikis were born. The best information could be found on GameFAQs, and rumors were abound to help you increase your luck or make your drop rate better. And if you were a PlayStation 2 player, connecting online to play the game was a huge deal. It added more monster types to fight, more maps, more armor sets, and even the endgame Elder Dragon fights. The downside is, if you were to go back and play the original PlayStation 2 game now that the online servers have been shut down, it means you get not anywhere near the entire game. You get less than half of the monsters originally included in the game, and you can obtain nearly 60% of the armor sets and weapons in the game, including all of the high-rank armors, unless you use something like a Game Shark or a modified ISO. But if you're interested in experiencing all of the content that the PlayStation 2 game had to offer, you could step up to the PSP port of the game, Monster Hunter Freedom. Monster Hunter Freedom brought the entirety of the PlayStation 2 experience over to the PlayStation Portable console in a slightly more compressed form. Gone were the right stick controls, and the game thankfully made the switch to the now iconic triangle, circle, and R button controls, though the PSP's lack of a right stick made the claw control scheme even more prevalent. The game featured all of the missions and monsters from the PlayStation 2 original, added a handful more monsters and quests, and allowed you to access it all without connecting to an online server. However, this came at a big trade-off. Not having any online play at all. The Portable series of games as a whole focused on local cooperative play instead of online play, which had its own benefits and downsides. Monster Hunter Portable added a lot of features to the series that have only been improved on since, like the farm for resource gathering, and it was in fact the first game in the series to actually have numerical skills on armor visible. In the PlayStation 2 original, all the skills were hidden and required you to experiment with different pieces of gear to find out what combinations gave which skills. Monster Hunter Portable was the first game to expose these skills to the player and allow for more in-depth customization of gear without relying on external guides. After Monster Hunter Portable was such a huge success, Monster Hunter DOS, or Monster Hunter 2, was released in Japan on the PlayStation 2. Monster Hunter DOS added a ton of new features to the game, being the first game in the series to include a day and night cycle, and even added seasons to the game, summer, winter, and breeding season, in which the maps changed drastically. Some areas were only accessible in certain seasons, and some maps, such as the Snowy Mountain map, were only accessible during the summer because winter would have been too cold. Breeding season meant that more carnivores were out in the maps, meaning more small monsters would swarm you while you're trying to take down your target. Monster Hunter DOS also introduced, for the first time, the gun lance, the longsword, the hunting horn, and a new ranged weapon, the bow. This was also the first generation where the dual blades were in every game, so I'll talk about them here too. The gun lance is a slightly more involved version of the lance, with a lot more moves to stay in the monster's face, but also including an incredible new move that allows you to charge an explosive shell, doing serious damage at a very short range at the expense of a large amount of sharpness. The longsword was a weapon type that was previously in Monster Hunter 1, but in that game it acted exactly like the greatsword. In this game, it's a quick and agile weapon that uses a combo system to do tons of damage. The dual blades are also a very agile weapon, basically an evolution of the sword and shield that sacrifices the protection of the shield for a second blade to do lots more damage. This was a great way to apply elemental damage or inflict statuses, as the blades hit a lot of times in a very short period. The hunting horn is the game's first support weapon. It allows you to play some musical note combinations to provide helpful buffs to the party, as well as having a hefty amount of knockout damage. It's a very unique weapon that takes a lot of skill to use, but having a hunting horn user can be a real game changer. The bow is the new ranged weapon in the game, which is a much faster ranged weapon than either one of the bow guns. It unsheathes faster and allows you to fire faster, but you can charge your arrows up to 3 levels, with each one of the levels being more and more powerful than the last. Unlike the bow guns, the bow itself can have an element, and the coatings that the bow uses allow it to apply status effects as well as increase the power of each attack. Since Monster Hunter DOS was on the PlayStation 2, the control scheme for the game went back to being the much maligned right analog stick attack method, with no way to change it to something more closely resembling Monster Hunter Freedom on the PSP. Lots of weapons received new moves, such as the sword and shield gaining the ability to use items on the go, greatsword and hammer charging, and the ability for weapons to go past green sharpness, increasing their damage multipliers even farther. The downside, once again, is that the game put its high-rank monsters behind an online-only barrier, meaning that people who wish to check out the game's unique features nowadays are locked to low rank only. Monster Hunter DOS's main town was called Jumbo Village, and the main quest revolved around rebuilding the village and taking out the Kushala Daora, the wind-based elder dragon that wiped it out in the first place. The online hub was Dundorma, which made an appearance in later games but was never, in fact, as busy as it was in this game. The addition of the weapons, new moves, and new maps were all brought forward into the PSP-exclusive sequel, Monster Hunter Freedom 2, but the entire storyline was changed and adapted to fit the handheld's limitations. Seasons were removed and the day-night cycle was changed to be on a per-quest basis instead of depending on what time of day you left the village. The main town was changed to Poke, a small village set in the snowy mountaintops. The combat controls were once again switched to the face buttons. Combat was rebalanced and made faster, and more monsters were added to the game. There was a follow-up game just over a year later called Monster Hunter Freedom Unite. Freedom Unite was the G-Rank update to Freedom 2 and is arguably the most popular Monster Hunter game in the entire series. It rebalanced combat once again, added a ton of new monsters, subspecies to those monsters, added hundreds of quests and new weapon upgrades. This was also the first game in the series that added feline companions, which were called palicos in later games. You could level them up and assign them skills, and have them fight alongside you in battle as a sort of replacement for your friends when you're playing solo. Freedom Unite is a great Monster Hunter game, and it's usually used as the baseline in comparison with later games.
The third generation of Monster Hunter probably brought about the most controversial and interesting changes in the series. Emphasis on controversial. There are a lot of smaller changes as well, like improved hitboxes, expanded and more versatile combos for older weapons, but when most hunters think about the third generation of Monster Hunter games, their immediate thought is typically the newly implemented swimming mechanic. I understandably dislike swimming, but I don't outright hate it. The idea of implementing three-dimensional combat to the series is an interesting one that would later be brought back in some capacity. As it stands, the way it's implemented in Monster Hunter Tri and 3 Ultimate leaves much to be desired. Instead of expanding upon your combat options, the third dimension only serves to make otherwise simple tasks more cumbersome. Mobility becomes sluggish, you can't utilize certain items, evasiveness got nerfed to the point of annoyance, especially against large and fast monsters. Due to the backlash towards the mechanic, it was removed in later generations, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm not entirely happy with that decision. I like what they replaced it with, which we'll get to later, but I think that if they gave the player more mobility and a few more combat options underwater, it could work. I'd love to see this return in a later generation if they can iron out the kinks, but that's a pipe dream for now. So let's move on to the third generation's new addition to the weapon roster, my much beloved Switch Axe. While I was introduced to this weapon in the fourth generation, I'd kick myself if I wasn't the one talking about it. The Switch Axe is best known for its ability to switch between axe and sword mode. This is one of the more versatile weapons in Monster Hunter. Axe mode is the default state of the weapon. Being the weaker of the two, many players make the mistake of ignoring it as a result, forcibly charging it into their blade mode. Axe mode, while weaker than blade mode, makes up for it in other ways. It has more reach, it has a good gap closer, and it allows for a lot of precision with its attacks. Blade mode has a much smaller move pool, but it makes up for that with higher damage and built-in Mind's Eye, the ability to attack anything without your weapon bouncing. Its role in combat is generally the same as Longsword. I'm trying to avoid tutorializing, though, so I'm just gonna have to leave it at that. I just wanted to give the weapon some love. Next up is, medium bowgun?
Well, sort of. Monster Hunter Tri on the Wii was heavily experimental, as you would expect a sequel to be. For instance, a couple of weapons were even removed from Monster Hunter Tri: the dual blades, hunting horn, gun lance, and bow, and certain weapons were made unlockables, like the aforementioned Switch Axe and Longsword. But the most odd change was the one to bowguns. In the other games in the series, bowguns allowed for a little bit of customization. Both bowguns allowed you to change the scopes, and the light bowgun allows you to change between a long barrel and a silencer, while heavy bowgun allows you to change between a power barrel or a shield. But Monster Hunter Tri really went all out with a customization. Instead of crafting a bowgun and then customizing it with parts, Tri was crazy enough to have you craft 3 separate parts for the bowgun: the stock, the frame, and the barrel, and the combination that you chose is what defined what class of bowgun it was. Going into detail about the different bowgun combinations is probably a little more than the scope of this video allows, but needless to say, it was a very hotly debated topic at the time. Some people absolutely loved it, allowing them to make very powerful combinations. Other people hated it, saying that it made the entire bowgun system needlessly complex. In any case, it was removed after Tri and it never came back. Third gen was definitely the generation that was known for the most experimentation though, as each game in the third gen had lots of changes made to it. For instance, the Japanese-only PSP release Portable Third was a side grade to Monster Hunter Tri made by a completely different team. It included a lot of the same gameplay as Tri, but it changed the setting and the story drastically. It's now set in a Japanese-inspired town called Yukumo, and the underwater combat in Tri was completely stripped out of Portable Third due to PSP limitations, which meant that almost all of the maps in Portable Third had to be reworked to replace the underwater areas. Portable Third was a fantastic entry to the series though, becoming not only the best-selling Monster Hunter game ever, but also the best-selling PSP game of all time.
Now for the generation I'm most familiar with. Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate is what brought a lot of newcomers to the series from what I understand. Much like the third generation, it took steps to speed up combat, expanding combos again, etc. But perhaps the most important change it made was the overhaul to three-dimensional combat. Gone is the jank-ass swimming of Tri and 3 Ultimate. No. Instead, they've decided to focus more on expanding ground-based combat by giving it a sense of verticality. The slow climbing and fall recovery of the older titles is now replaced with a fast and efficient climbing system, and now you can carry your forward momentum upon landing. This, alongside other minor changes to combat, make for some of the most energized combat in the entire series so far. At least till World comes out. It is out right now. But it wasn't when I was writing this. Alongside these changes to mobility and three-dimensional combat, the 4th generation brought about 2 weapons that are among the more complex in the series. To tie directly into the 3D combat, first up is the Insect Glaive, a weapon focused primarily on aerial combat. With its ability to vault and attack in mid-air at will, as well as another prominent feature, the Kinsect, in its heyday it was among the most popular weapons in online play. To the point of annoyance, honestly, but hey, it was popular for a reason, I suppose. The Charge Blade is a different story altogether. While nearly as popular as the Insect Glaive, this is probably the most complex, high-maintenance weapon in the series thus far. Overtly so, honestly. At its most basic, it can be described as a sword and shield which are combined into an axe. Delving further in, however, it has a lot going on under the hood. First, you've got Files. This powers up your axe mode, which, unlike Switch Axe, the 2 modes are switched between freely, but your Files are where the true power of the weapon lies. Files are charged by landing hits with your sword and shield, glowing different colors depending on how many files can be filled. If you go over capacity with your sword, the weapon will start to bounce, so you're forced to charge your axe to continue the battle. Additionally, in axe mode, while there are a few different ways to unleash these files, they're typically used for the amped elemental discharge. And while this is an attack, the first thing Charge Blade users often do is cancel out of their attack to put files into their shield to buff the physical damage output of the axe mode and the defense of the shield mode, and well, I know there are plenty of people out there that appreciate the weapon's complexity, it just doesn't click with me. Props to the people that can use it, but it ain't for me. Until World came out and changed that. Now, Monster Hunter Generations is kind of an outlier among the series, as all the features I'm about to talk about from the 4th generation that arose from it and Double Cross will not be in the upcoming Monster Hunter World, though certain aspects of the features from Generations definitely inspired attacks and gameplay elements that we'd consider new in Monster Hunter World. The biggest changes brought about in Generations are hunting styles and hunter arts. Hunting styles change how weapons function, be it sacrificing the new combos introduced in the 4th and 3rd generation in favor of having an extended move pool of hunter arts with the new striker style, business as usual with the guild style, or the high-risk, high-reward styles centered around evasion like adept and brave style, or aerial style, in which your dodge is now extended, but allows any player with any weapon to use contact with a monster to vault themselves into the air for an easy aerial attack. Fittingly enough, the inclusion of these features was meant to allow players a wider variety of playstyles, as the developers at Generations found it interesting how their players all had unique approaches to combat in the earlier entries, even with the same weapon class. Hunting arts, on the other hand, are a bit simpler to explain. While they can be used for simple buffs and healing, they're more popularly known for extending the player's moveset with what you may better know as super moves. Charge a meter by attacking monsters over the course of a hunt, and unleash new powerful moves for extra damage. For some fans, the inclusion of hunting styles and arts was making the game too easy, and while I'll grant that styles are poorly balanced, such as the overpowered adept style, I think it did add some extra flavor to the gameplay. I'm not torn up over their exclusion from World, but I'm glad that we had them when we did. I'm sure the 5th generation of Monster Hunter will more than make up for it. It totally did, by the way. The last thing I want to talk about regarding hunters and their role in combat design is the co-op. I'm honestly surprised I didn't bring this up sooner. This is arguably Monster Hunter's biggest feature, the main draw for many players outside of, hunting monsters. Most would assume that co-op is co-op. What's worth bringing up? Isn't it basically just single player but with more players? Short answer, no. Long answer, coordination and player positioning is important. Most weapons have a specific role, and being mindful of your fellow hunters is paramount. Unlike many cooperative games, Monster Hunter has friendly fire. Well, soft friendly fire, as QB puts it. Hitting your teammates won't actually do any damage to them, but it can result in them getting tripped and knocked over, canceling their healing, launching them bodily into the air, or making them accidentally miss their dodge window from potentially lethal monster attacks. If you just go in swinging with no regard for your team, more often than not you'll either piss them off and possibly find yourself kicked from the party upon the end of the quest. That said, there's a lot of fun to be had with co-op in Monster Hunter, as there is with any game. In some instances, you can actually take advantage of hitting your teammates. If you find your comrades are stunned or afflicted with sleep ailment, a swift smack across the head will help them get back into the action. Your teammates can even boot you in the butt when you're setting a trap, if the trap isn't going to do any good. Additionally, launching your teammates into the air with notice can allow them to pull off aerial attacks. There's a lot I could talk about in regards to jolly cooperation, but it's more than anyone could feasibly fit into a single video, so I hope that'll suffice. This part is running a bit long, ain't it? If you liked it, definitely stick around for next week when we'll be looking at the monster design for the series. And if you really want more Monster Hunter content right now, check out QB's channel Question Block Gaming for regular Monster Hunter streams. And probably some other stuff. It'll be great! That said, I hope you all have a fantastic night and that this video lit a fire under you. Peace! Come to recover.